Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Pike County, Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The disappearance of Margaret Hatfield in the winter of 1854 remains one of Pike County's most perplexing mysteries. What began as a routine medical examination in the county doctor's office evolved into a case that would baffle local authorities, medical professionals, and eventually attract the attention of scientific minds from as far as Boston and Philadelphia. The woman who vanished that December evening left behind no witnesses to her fate, only a collection of medical records, journal entries, and correspondence that paint a disturbing picture of what may have occurred in that remote Appalachian community. Pike County in 1854 was a place of stark contrasts. Coal mining had begun to transform the region's economy, bringing with it both prosperity and division. The county seat of Pikeville, nestled in a narrow valley between steep, densely forested mountains, housed approximately 300 residents. Winter arrived early that year, with heavy snowfall isolating many of the outlying homesteads before Thanksgiving. The Levisa Fork of the Big Sandy River had partially frozen by early December, further restricting travel through the region. The mountains loomed dark and imposing, their peaks often hidden in low-hanging clouds that lingered for days, casting the valley in perpetual twilight. It was against this backdrop of isolation that Margaret Hatfield, aged 37, made her way to Dr. Ephraim Stanton's office on the afternoon of December 7th. According to the doctor's records, Margaret had been experiencing episodes of unusual behavior for approximately 4 months. Her husband, Thomas Hatfield, a moderately successful timber merchant, had initially attributed his wife's condition to female hysteria and had attempted to treat her with various home remedies before finally seeking medical attention. The journey from the Hatfield homestead to Pikeville normally took just over 2 hours by horse-drawn wagon. On that particular December day, with snowdrifts blocking portions of the narrow mountain road, the journey took nearly 5 hours. By the time the Hatfields arrived at Dr. Stanton's office, a modest 2-story structure on the eastern edge of town, the short winter day was already fading toward dusk. A contemporaneous account from Abigail Werner, whose millinery shop stood opposite the doctor's residence, noted the arrival of the Hatfield wagon. Mrs. Hatfield sat perfectly still throughout, even as the wagon navigated the rutted street, Werner later testified. Stanton's examination notes from that day describe Margaret as pale, significantly underweight, with unusual dilation of the pupils. He noted that her speech was precise and measured, yet oddly disconnected from the questions posed. The doctor recorded that Margaret maintained unwavering eye contact throughout the examination, to a degree that produced considerable discomfort. What follows in the medical record is perhaps the first indication that Margaret Hatfield's case was far from ordinary. She stared straight ahead, her posture unnaturally rigid, while her husband spoke to her with increasing agitation. It appeared as though she either could not or would not respond to him. Dr. Patient speaks of her body as though it were a vessel, Dr. Stanton wrote. She refers to her hands as these appendages and describes sensations within her abdomen as the movements. When questioned directly about her identity, she responded, "Margaret exists here, but not in the manner you perceive." Patient displays no fever, yet her skin is unnaturally cool to the touch, particularly at the extremities. The doctor's notes continue with observations of Margaret's physical condition. Stanton noting that she seemed to take exactly 12 breaths per minute, each inhalation and exhalation of identical duration, as though precisely timed. When he listened to her heart with his stethoscope, he detected what he described as a curious secondary rhythm, almost like an echo following each primary beat. Unable to attribute this to any known medical condition, he noted it simply as anomalous cardiac patterning of unknown etiology. Thomas Hatfield waited in the ISMA doctor's front room during the examination. Her pulse was recorded as unusually slow and strong, approximately 40 beats per minute, yet regular. Her breathing was similarly measured, with Doctor, according to a subsequent statement he provided to the county sheriff, he heard no unusual sounds from the examination room. Dr. Stanton emerged after approximately 40 minutes to inform him that he wished to keep Margaret overnight for observation. Thomas agreed, later stating that the doctor's concern seemed genuine, and the worsening weather made the prospect of returning to their home, located some 7 miles outside of Pikeville, increasingly dangerous. "I asked if I might speak with my wife before departing," Thomas stated in his testimony. The doctor allowed this, though he cautioned me that she seemed to be in a state of significant disassociation. When I entered the examination room, Margaret was seated exactly as I had left her, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the opposite wall. I spoke her name 3 times before she turned to look at me. When our eyes met, I cannot describe it adequately. It was as though I were being observed by someone who had merely borrowed my wife's features. Thomas reported that Margaret spoke to him briefly before he left. Her words, as he recalled them, were, "It is nearly complete now, Thomas. The change has progressed further than even I anticipated. You should not return tomorrow. What you find may cause you unnecessary distress." When he asked her to explain, she reportedly smiled in a manner he described as entirely unfamiliar, not Margaret's smile at all, and turned her attention back to the wall. What happened during that night remains largely unknown. Dr. Stanton's records contain only a single additional entry regarding Margaret, timed at 8:17 p.m. It reads, "Patient exhibits increasing agitation, claims the transition is nearly complete. Have administered laudanum to induce sleep. Will continue observation through the night." By morning, Margaret Hatfield was gone. The room where she had been kept showed no signs of disturbance. The window remained locked from the inside, and the only door opened directly into Dr. Stanton's private quarters, where he insisted he had remained awake throughout the night. Thomas Hatfield was summoned immediately, arriving at the doctor's residence by mid-morning. What followed was a search that would ultimately involve nearly every able-bodied man in Pikeville. Sheriff William Caudle organized the search parties, dividing the town and surrounding areas into sections to be methodically examined. His official report describes the process. 4 groups of 6 men each examined the town proper, while an additional 8 groups searched the immediate surroundings, paying particular attention to the river and the western forest edge. Weather conditions were favorable for tracking, with approximately 6 inches of undisturbed snow covering the ground. No footprints were discovered leading from Dr. Stanton's residence save those made by the doctor himself earlier that morning when he ventured to his woodpile. No trace of Margaret was found, not a footprint in the fresh snow, not a disturbed branch in the surrounding woods, not a single sighting by any resident of the small community. It was as though she had simply ceased to exist. The official report filed by Sheriff Caudle on December 10th noted, "No evidence of foul play has been discovered. No blood, no signs of struggle." The circumstances of Mrs. Hatfield's disappearance remain inexplicable. The sheriff's private journal, however, contains additional observations not included in the official record. "I have been in law enforcement for 17 years, he wrote on December 11th, "and have never encountered a case that defies explanation to this degree. I examined the room myself no fewer than 4 times. The single window was secured by both a latch and a nail driven through the frame. The floorboards were solid, with no evidence of secret passages or hidden compartments. The chimney was far too narrow to permit passage of a human body. I am left with the disturbing conclusion that either Dr. Stanton is concealing information, a possibility I find unlikely given his reputation and evident distress, or something occurred in that room that exceeds the boundaries of conventional understanding." In the weeks that followed, Dr. Stanton began to document his own observations and theories regarding Margaret's case. His personal journal, discovered after his death in 1868, reveals a man increasingly obsessed with understanding what had occurred that night. I cannot escape the sensation that I witnessed something beyond the realm of current scientific understanding, he wrote on December 23, 1854. The woman who sat before me spoke with Margaret Hatfield's voice, yet something in her eyes suggested an awareness that was not entirely human. The doctor's subsequent entries detail his attempts to reconcile what he had observed with his medical training. He considered various diagnoses, from rare neurological conditions to previously undocumented forms of mental illness, but found each explanation inadequate. None of these conditions, he wrote, would account for the physical anomalies I observed, nor could they explain the method of her departure from a secured room. What troubled Dr. Stanton most, according to his journal, was not the mystery of how Margaret had vanished, but rather the growing conviction that her disappearance represented not an ending, but a transformation. She spoke repeatedly of transition and becoming, he noted. These terms suggest not death or departure, but evolution, a change from one state of being to another. What if what I witnessed was not a disappearance at all, but rather the final stage of a metamorphosis we have no framework to comprehend? The doctor's journal entries grow increasingly erratic over the subsequent months. He describes waking to the sound of Margaret's voice, neither near nor distant, but somehow originating within my own thoughts. He records dreams in which he sees her standing at the edge of the forest that bordered his property, her form somehow indistinct, as though viewed through rippling water. By March of 1855, he had begun to document changes in his own perception, noting that ordinary objects sometimes appear briefly transparent, revealing complex geometries beneath their surface appearance. Thomas Hatfield, meanwhile, returned to their homestead and maintained a silent vigil for his wife's return. According to accounts from neighbors who occasionally checked on his welfare, the man grew increasingly reclusive. Jeremiah Collins, whose farm adjoined the Hatfield property, reported visiting in January of 1855 and finding Thomas much altered in his habits and appearance. Collins stated that the house was maintained in perfect order, as though Mrs. Hatfield might return at any moment, but that Thomas himself appeared to be neglecting his own health and hygiene. A local minister, Reverend Josiah Palmer, recorded in his church records that he visited the Hatfield home in February of 1855 and found Thomas much altered in countenance and disposition. The Reverend wrote, "He sits for hours, staring at his wife's empty chair. When questioned about her possible whereabouts, he responds only, 'She told me it would happen this way.'" What Margaret might have meant by such a statement remains unclear. No correspondence written by her has ever been discovered, no diary entries, no personal accounts that might shed light on her experiences prior to her disappearance. She exists in the historical record only through the observations of others, an absence that itself becomes a presence in the narrative that unfolded. One of the few physical artifacts connected to Margaret Hatfield is a brooch that was discovered in the doctor's examination room 3 days after her disappearance. The item, a silver oval containing what appeared to be a lock of dark hair encased under glass, was not recognized by Thomas as belonging to his wife. Dr. Stanton claimed no knowledge of it, insisting it had not been present during his examination. The object was unusual in its craftsmanship, featuring engravings along the edge that Sheriff Caudle described as resembling no alphabet I have encountered, yet giving the distinct impression of language rather than mere decoration. The brooch was kept in the sheriff's office as potential evidence, though its connection to the case remained unclear. In March of 1855, a visiting peddler who dealt in jewelry examined the piece and declared it certainly not of American manufacture nor European in design. He suggested it might be of Eastern origin, perhaps Indian or Persian, though he admitted he had never seen metalwork of precisely that style before. The brooch subsequently disappeared from the sheriff's evidence cabinet, its whereabouts unknown. By spring of 1855, interest in the case had spread beyond Pike County. A physician from Louisville, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, traveled to Pikeville specifically to interview Dr. Stanton and examine his records. Whitfield's subsequent paper, published in a medical journal later that year, suggested that Margaret had suffered from a previously undocumented form of mental deterioration, likely exacerbated by the isolation of rural life. He proposed that she had simply wandered away during a moment when Dr. Stanton had fallen asleep and had subsequently perished in the harsh winter conditions. This explanation might have been accepted had Thomas Hatfield not vehemently rejected it. In a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, he wrote, "My wife did not wander into the wilderness to die. Margaret knew precisely what was happening to her. She spoke of it for months before her transformation. Those who suggest otherwise did not know her as I did." The use of the word transformation caught the attention of another medical professional, Dr. Elias Chambers of Philadelphia. In the summer of 1855, Chambers arrived in Pike County to conduct his own investigation. What he discovered would form the basis of a monograph that, while largely dismissed by the medical establishment of the time, would later be referenced by researchers interested in unexplained disappearances throughout the Appalachian region. Chambers interviewed not only Dr. Stanton and Thomas Hatfield, but also numerous residents of the area who had interacted with Margaret in the months leading up to her disappearance. A pattern emerged from these accounts. Margaret had begun to change in subtle ways starting in August of 1854. She spoke less frequently. Her movements became more deliberate, almost mechanical. She developed an intense interest in the night sky, often standing in the yard of her home for hours after sunset, regardless of weather conditions. Several witnesses mentioned that Margaret had taken to collecting specific plants from the surrounding forest, herbs and roots not commonly used in cooking or medicine. Thomas confirmed this behavior, but claimed ignorance as to her purpose. She would bring them into the house and arrange them in patterns on the floor of our bedroom, he told Chambers. When I questioned her, she would only say, "They help me hear the others more clearly." The others, to whom Margaret referred, remained unidentified. No visitors to the Hatfield home had been observed during this period. The nearest neighbors lived nearly a mile away. When pressed on this point, Thomas stated that his wife had begun to spend significant time in a small clearing approximately half a mile into the forest behind their property. He had followed her once, observing from a distance as she sat motionless on a fallen tree for over 2 hours, occasionally speaking aloud, though no one else was present. Of particular interest to Dr. Chambers was an account provided by Martha Givens, the midwife who had attended to Margaret during a miscarriage in the spring of 1854. Givens reported that following the loss of the pregnancy, Margaret and Thomas's third unsuccessful attempt to have a child, Margaret had made an unusual statement. "She told me that perhaps it was for the best," Givens recalled. She said, "The children that come through me now would not belong entirely to this world." When I asked her to explain, she smiled in a way that raised the hair on my arms and said, "We are not as solid as we appear, Martha. There are spaces between the smallest parts of us, and sometimes things from elsewhere can move through those spaces." Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from Sarah Collins, a neighbor who had known Margaret since childhood. Collins described visiting the Hatfield home in late October of 1854 and finding Margaret sitting motionless at her kitchen table, staring fixedly at the wall. "I spoke her name 3 times before she responded," Collins stated. "When she finally turned to me, her eyes seemed different, deeper somehow. She smiled and said, 'Soon this will all be memory, Sarah. They're coming to bring me home.' I asked who was coming, but she only shook her head and returned to staring at the wall." Collins further reported that as she was leaving, Margaret had taken her hand and pressed something into her palm, a small smooth stone with unusual markings etched into its surface. "She told me to keep it close if I ever wished to speak with her after she was gone," Collins said. "I thought she was referring to a planned trip, perhaps to visit family elsewhere. Now I wonder what she truly meant." The stone remained in Collins's possession until her death in 1891. Her daughter subsequently donated it to the Pike County Historical Society, where it was cataloged simply as carved stone of unknown origin. Dr. Chambers's investigation took an unexpected turn when he discovered that Margaret was not the first resident of Pike County to disappear under unusual circumstances. County records from 1819 documented the case of Ezekiel Harmon, a trapper who vanished from his cabin near what is now the Breaks Interstate Park area. Harmon had reportedly been acting strangely for several weeks before his disappearance, telling neighbors that he was being called to something in the deep woods. A journal reportedly belonging to Harmon had been found in his abandoned cabin. The final entries, spanning approximately 2 weeks before his disappearance, described increasingly vivid dreams of a city of impossible geometry where the buildings move and breathe. He wrote of hearing voices that spoke not in words but in sensations that somehow conveyed meaning. His final entry, dated 3 days before he was last seen, read simply, "They have shown me how to open the way. The body is merely the first shell we outgrow." Further research revealed similar cases in 1832 and 1847, each involving individuals who displayed marked behavioral changes before vanishing without explanation. In each instance, searches yielded no results, and in each case, those who disappeared had made cryptic statements about transitions or transformations in the days leading up to their disappearances. Dr. Chambers became convinced that these cases represented a previously undocumented psychological phenomenon specific to isolated mountain communities. In his monograph, he proposed that extended isolation combined with certain personality traits could produce a state of environmental dissociation in which individuals developed the unshakable belief that they were being called away by some external force. This theory gained little traction in medical circles. Dr. Stanton, however, found it woefully inadequate to explain what he had witnessed. In a letter to Chambers dated October 1855, he wrote, "Your explanation fails to account for the physical anomalies I observed in Mrs. Hatfield. The unusual temperature of her skin, the way her pupils would contract and expand independent of changes in light. Most significantly, it fails to explain how a woman under my direct observation could vanish from a locked room without disturbing any object or leaving any trace of her passage." Stanton went on to describe an incident he had not previously disclosed to investigators. "On the night of Margaret's disappearance," he wrote, "I observed a curious phenomenon shortly after midnight. The air in the hallway outside her room seemed to shimmer, as though viewed through rising heat waves, though the temperature was quite cold. This disturbance lasted approximately 45 seconds, during which time I experienced a sensation of pressure in my ears and a momentary distortion of vision. When these effects subsided, I immediately checked on Mrs. Hatfield, finding her apparently asleep. It was only upon my next check, approximately 1 hour later, that I discovered her absence." Thomas Hatfield never remarried. He continued to live in the same house until his death in 1866. Local accounts suggest that he maintained his wife's garden exactly as she had left it, and kept her clothing laid out as though she might return at any moment. The most compelling document left by Thomas is a journal entry dated exactly 1 year after Margaret's disappearance. In it he wrote, "I saw her last night, standing at the edge of the clearing. The moonlight shone through her as though she were made of glass or water. She beckoned to me, but I could not make myself cross the threshold. I called out to her, asking if she was at peace. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, when she answered, 'I am not as you remember me, Thomas. What I have become cannot be explained in words you would understand, but know that I chose this. I heard them calling since I was a child, and finally I answered.'" Thomas's account might be dismissed as the desperate fantasy of a grieving husband, were it not for a curious detail added at the end of the entry. "She raised her hand in farewell, and I saw that her fingers had grown strangely elongated, the joints more numerous than in a human hand. Then she turned and walked into the forest, her body seeming to dissolve into the mist, rising from the ground." Thomas Hatfield's journal contains several subsequent entries describing similar encounters, though with decreasing frequency over the years. His final mention of Margaret comes in an entry dated October 1865, just 5 months before his own death. "I have not seen her in nearly 2 years now," he wrote. "The clearing where we used to meet has grown over, the old fallen log now rotted away entirely. I wonder if she has moved on to places even further removed from this world, or if perhaps the change in her is now so complete that she can no longer make herself perceptible to human senses. I find I am no longer afraid of what she has become. Instead, I envy her freedom from the constraints that bind the rest of us to our narrow existence." Dr. Stanton's obsession with the case continued until his death. His later journal entries suggest he began to experience phenomena similar to what Margaret had described before her disappearance. He wrote of hearing voices from the spaces between thoughts, and of seeing figures at the periphery of his vision that vanished when directly observed. In his final journal entry, dated 3 days before his body was discovered in his office, he wrote, "I understand now what she meant. The body is merely a vessel, and what we perceive as reality is but one layer of existence. She did not disappear. She transcended, and I believe I shall soon follow." The official cause of Dr. Stanton's death was listed as apoplexy, though the examining physician noted unusual dilation of the pupils and an expression of profound wonder frozen on the deceased's face. Most of Dr. Stanton's records regarding Margaret Hatfield disappeared after his death. The few documents that survived were eventually collected by the Kentucky Historical Society in 1923, where they remained largely forgotten until 1962. One of Dr. Stanton's colleagues, Dr. Samuel Wilkinson, provided an account of Stanton's behavior in the weeks before his death. "Ephraim had become entirely consumed by the Hatfield case," Wilkinson wrote in a letter to a mutual acquaintance. "He spoke of little else and had taken to spending nights in his office rather than his home, claiming he could hear more clearly there. His physical appearance deteriorated rapidly. He lost weight. His hands developed a persistent tremor, and his eyes took on a strangely luminous quality, particularly in dim light. Yet despite these concerning changes, he appeared energized, even euphoric at times. I am beginning to perceive the underlying architecture," he told me during our last meeting. When I asked what he meant, he merely smiled and said, "The world is not as solid as we believe, Samuel. There are spaces between." The phrase "there are spaces between" appears with striking consistency throughout the Hatfield case and similar incidents in the region. It suggests a perception of reality as permeable or layered, a concept that conflicts with the materialist scientific paradigm dominant in the 19th century, but finds curious resonance with certain aspects of quantum physics that would not be discovered for decades to come. Sheriff William Caudle, who had led the initial investigation into Margaret's disappearance, remained troubled by the case throughout his career. In 1858, he wrote to Dr. E. Chambers requesting information about similar cases the physician might have encountered elsewhere. "I find myself unable to dismiss this matter as mere superstition or medical anomaly," Caudle wrote. "In my 20 years of law enforcement, I have seen my share of the strange and terrible, but nothing that defied explanation so completely as this. I am not a man given to flights of fancy, yet I cannot escape the sense that what occurred here represents a glimpse of something beyond our conventional understanding, a tear in the fabric of what we consider possible." Chambers responded with accounts of 3 cases he had documented in other parts of Appalachia, 2 in West Virginia, and 1 in eastern Tennessee. Each involved individuals who exhibited behavioral changes similar to Margaret's before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. None, however, had vanished from secured rooms under direct observation, making the Hatfield case unique in its evidential challenge to conventional explanation. That year, Dr. Harlan Chambers, grandson of Dr. Elias Chambers, discovered his grandfather's monograph while organizing family papers. Intrigued by the case, he traveled to Pike County to conduct follow-up research. What he found was a community still reluctant to discuss the Hatfield case or the subsequent disappearances that had occurred in the region, or there had been others. County records documented at least 7 unexplained disappearances between 1854 and 1962, each bearing similarities to Margaret's case. In each instance, the individual had displayed behavioral changes before vanishing. In each case, no trace was ever found despite extensive searches. The most recent case Harlan documented involved Eleanor Sizemore, a 42-year-old schoolteacher who disappeared from her home in 1958. Sizemore had reportedly begun to exhibit unusual behaviors approximately 3 months before her disappearance, including extended periods of silence and intense interest in certain locations in the surrounding forest, and increasingly abstract and disconnected speech patterns. A colleague reported that Sizemore had told her, "I'm beginning to see through the surfaces of things. There's so much more beyond what we perceive." Sizemore was last seen by her sister, who visited her home and found her sitting motionless in her garden, staring at the edge of the forest. When approached, Sizemore reportedly smiled and said, "It won't be long now." They're almost close enough to reach through. Her sister left to prepare dinner, and upon returning to the garden 15 minutes later, found it empty. No trace of Eleanor Sizemore was ever discovered, despite an extensive search involving tracking dogs and over 50 volunteers. Dr. Harlan Chambers attempted to publish his findings in a scientific journal, but was rejected due to insufficient empirical evidence. Undeterred, he self-published a small book titled The Transcended Unexplained Disappearances in Appalachia in 1963. The book received little attention outside of paranormal research circles and soon faded into obscurity. One detail from Harlan Chambers' research bears particular mention. During his visit to Pike County, he located the former site of the Hatfield home, by then long abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. Local residents advised against visiting the location, claiming that strange phenomena had been reported in the area for generations. Ignoring these warnings, Chambers hiked to the site on a clear September afternoon. He later wrote, "Nothing remains of the structure except the stone foundation and chimney. The forest has completely engulfed what was once a cleared homestead. As I stood among the ruins, I experienced a sudden and inexplicable drop in temperature. The air became perfectly still. Then, from somewhere in the surrounding woods, I heard what sounded like a woman's voice, distant yet perfectly clear, say, 'We are always becoming, always transitioning, always transcending.' I called out, receiving no response except the echo of my own voice. I searched the area thoroughly, but found no evidence that anyone else was present." What Chambers did not include in his published account, but documented in his private notes, was what occurred as he was leaving the site. Approximately 50 yards from the foundation, he wrote, I glanced back and observed what appeared to be a figure standing beside the chimney. The form was indistinct, seeming to waver like a heat mirage, but gave the impression of a woman in 19th century dress. When I turned to approach, the figure dissolved into what looked like mist, though the day was clear and dry. More disturbing was what I discovered upon returning to my hotel room that evening. A small, smooth stone had somehow been placed in my jacket pocket. Upon examination, I found it bore markings identical to those described in Sarah Collins's account from 1854. Chambers cut his research trip short after this experience, returning to his home in Richmond, Virginia. He never again visited Pike County, though he maintained correspondence with several local historians until his death in 1968. His papers, including his notes on the Hatfield case, were donated to the University of Virginia's Special Collections, but have rarely been accessed by researchers. The stone Chambers described was not found among his possessions after his death. His widow reported that he had kept it in his desk drawer, but that it had disappeared approximately 2 weeks before he suffered the stroke that ultimately claimed his life. She recalled that during those final weeks, Her husband had become increasingly agitated, claiming to hear voices speaking to him from inside the walls and insisting that he could see through solid objects to the spaces between. The case of Margaret Hatfield exemplifies what might be termed the science of the unexplainable, instances where conventional scientific methodology proves inadequate to account for observed phenomena. What happened to Margaret on that winter night in 1854 remains beyond explanation. The witnesses to her life and disappearance are long dead. The location where these events occurred has been transformed by time and development. All that remains are fragments, documents, testimonies, questions without answers. Was Margaret suffering from a previously undocumented medical condition? Did she experience some form of psychological break that drove her to flee into the wilderness? Or, as the more fantastical interpretations suggest, did she somehow transcend the boundaries of conventional existence? The scientific paradigm of the 1850s offered few frameworks for understanding cases like Margaret's. The emerging field of psychology was in its infancy. Neurology had yet to develop the sophisticated understanding of brain function that might explain her behavioral changes. The concept of mental illness itself was still largely shrouded in superstition and moral judgment. Modern science might approach such a case differently, bringing to bear advanced neuroimaging, psychological profiling, and forensic techniques unavailable to Dr. Stanton and his contemporaries. Yet even now, certain aspects of the case would likely remain puzzling, particularly the question of how an adult woman could vanish from a secured room without leaving any trace of her passage. Pike County has changed dramatically since 1854. The coal industry transformed the region's economy and landscape throughout the 20th century. Roads now connect areas that were once accessible only by horseback or on foot. Yet the mountains remain ancient and impassive, perhaps still harboring secrets from generations past. Local folklore in the region still includes whispered accounts of the vanished ones, people who hear the calling and disappear into the forests, never to return. Most dismiss these stories as superstition, the kind of tale that naturally evolves in isolated communities with strong oral traditions. Scientists and historians point to more mundane explanations: mental illness, deliberate disappearances to escape difficult circumstances, or simply the dangers posed by rugged wilderness to disoriented individuals. Yet for those who have studied the Hatfield case in detail, questions linger. The circumstances of Margaret's disappearance from a locked room, the similar patterns observed in other cases throughout the region's history, the consistent reports of behavioral changes before each disappearance. These elements suggest something beyond conventional explanation. In 1966, a psychology professor from the University of Kentucky interviewed elderly residents of Pike County regarding local folklore. One woman, then in her 90s, recalled stories told by her grandmother about people who became something else. When asked to elaborate, she explained, "The old ones believed that some folks could hear voices from the other side of the world. Not heaven or hell, mind you, but another world that exists alongside our own, just out of sight. Those who could hear the voices would start to change. They'd grow distant, speak differently. And eventually, if they listened long enough, they'd learn how to cross over." This concept of crossing over appears repeatedly in Appalachian folklore, often associated with certain locations in the mountains considered to be thin places, where the boundary between worlds is less distinct. Margaret Hatfield's home was reportedly built near such a location, a fact that Dr. Stanton noted in his journal, but dismissed as superstition. In the 1970s, a geological survey of the area revealed an unusual feature beneath the former Hatfield property, a series of caverns extending deep into the mountain, some containing unusual mineral formations not commonly found in the region. Local mining companies avoided the area, citing concerns about structural instability. Some long-time residents, however, suggested a different reason for this avoidance. Those caves have always had a bad reputation. one elderly miner told a newspaper reporter in 1975. Even before they were officially discovered, people knew something wasn't right about that land. Animals avoid it. Electronic equipment malfunctions there. And some folks who went exploring too deep never came back out. The final piece of the Hatfield puzzle emerged in 1967 when renovations to the old Pike County Courthouse revealed a sealed compartment in the wall of what had once been the sheriff's office. Inside was a metal box containing several documents, including a personal letter written by Sheriff William Caudill to his successor before leaving office in 1856. The letter, now preserved in the Pike County Historical Society archives, contains a passage regarding the Hatfield case. I have not included certain details in the official record, as they would strain credulity and serve no purpose in advancing justice. I will, however, set them down here for your knowledge alone. When examining the room from which Mrs. Hatfield vanished, I discovered a peculiar residue on the floorboards beneath her bed. It had the appearance of fine sand, yet when touched, it seemed to dissolve into the air itself. More disturbing was what I found impressed into the surface of her pillow, not the indentation of a human head, but what appeared to be a pattern of ridges and spirals unlike anything I have ever seen. Dr. Stanton observed these phenomena as well, but could offer no explanation. We agreed that these details should be omitted from public record to prevent unnecessary speculation and fear. The letter continues with an account of Caudill's final interview with Thomas Hatfield. When pressed as to whether he believed his wife might still be alive, Hatfield gave a response I shall never forget. He said, "She is not dead, Sheriff, but neither is she any longer what we would recognize as alive. She has moved beyond those categories into something else entirely." When I asked what he meant, he replied, "Have you ever watched a caterpillar build its cocoon? It dissolves itself entirely before reforming as something new. Margaret did not die or disappear. She transformed. And somewhere, in some form I cannot comprehend, she continues." What are we to make of such testimony? From a modern perspective, it is easy to dismiss 19th century accounts as products of superstition or limited scientific understanding. Yet the consistency of the reports surrounding Margaret Hatfield's case and the similar cases that followed suggests that something genuine, if inexplicable, occurred in those mountains. Science advances by exploring the boundaries of the known world, occasionally encountering phenomena that challenge existing paradigms. The case of Margaret Hatfield represents one such boundary, a point where documented observation meets the limits of explanation. What happened to the woman whom science couldn't explain? The answer remains elusive, echoing through time like a voice from the forest, heard but never fully understood. In the late 1970s, Dr. Evelyn Mercer, a neuropsychiatrist researching unusual dissociative states, became interested in the historical cases documented in Pike County. She spent 3 summers conducting interviews and examining available records, ultimately publishing a paper titled Transcendent Dissociation, a proposed neurological basis for perceived boundary dissolution. In it, she suggested that certain individuals might experience atypical activity in the temporoparietal junction, the area of the brain responsible for distinguishing between self and other, resulting in a profound alteration of bodily awareness and environmental boundaries. Mercer proposed that this neurological state, combined with the sensory deprivation often experienced in isolated mountain communities during winter months, could produce the subjective experience of dissolving or transitioning between states of being. She noted that similar accounts appear in various cultural contexts throughout history, from shamanic traditions to certain mystical religious experiences. What makes the Pike County cases unique, she wrote, is not the subjective experiences reported by those who later disappeared, but rather the objective circumstances of the disappearances themselves. Neuropsychiatry can potentially explain why Margaret Hatfield believed she was transforming, but it cannot account for her physical vanishing from a secured room under direct observation. Mercer's research took an unexpected turn when she discovered a journal belonging to a local physician who had briefly treated Margaret Hatfield for a respiratory ailment in the summer of 1854, approximately 5 months before her disappearance. The doctor had noted an unusual feature in Margaret's eyes. The patient's irises display a distinctive pattern I have not previously encountered, concentric rings of slightly varying coloration, giving the impression of depth beyond what is anatomically possible. When observed in certain lighting conditions, these patterns appear to shift subtly, an effect I attribute to variations in pupillary dilation. This detail, not mentioned in Dr. Stanton's more comprehensive examination notes, caught Mercer's attention. She found similar descriptions in medical records related to 2 other individuals who later disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the region: Eleanor Sizemore in 1958 and Jackson Witt in 1913. In each case, a medical professional had documented unusual ocular features months before the person vanished. Mercer attempted to develop a cohesive theory that could explain both the neuropsychological aspects of the cases and the physical disappearances. She proposed that certain individuals might possess atypical neurological architecture that, when subjected to specific environmental triggers, could lead to altered states of consciousness. The disappearances themselves, she suggested, might represent a phenomenon at the intersection of psychology and physics, a dissolution of conventional boundaries that we lack the scientific framework to fully comprehend. Her theories were largely dismissed by the scientific community. One colleague famously responded, "Dr. Mercer has written a paper that begins in the realm of neuroscience and ends in science fiction." Undeterred, Mercer continued her research until her retirement in 1992, maintaining that conventional scientific paradigms were inadequate to explain cases like Margaret Hatfield's. In his final published work, Dr. Harlan Chambers wrote, "Perhaps the most profound scientific discoveries await us not in distant galaxies or subatomic particles, but in the unexplained absences that punctuate human experience, the disappearances that leave no witnesses, the transformations that occur beyond observation, the boundaries crossed without leaving footprints in the snow." The scientific establishment largely ignored Chambers's poetic speculation. Yet in recent decades, theoretical physics has increasingly explored concepts that would have seemed equally fantastical in his time: parallel universes, higher dimensions, and the strange implications of quantum mechanics that suggest reality, at its most fundamental level, behaves in ways that defy conventional logic. Could Margaret Hatfield have somehow intuited or experienced what science would only later begin to theorize? The question remains unanswerable, yet compelling in its implications. If nothing else, her case reminds us that the boundaries of the possible are not fixed, but rather expand with our understanding, and that, even in an age of scientific advancement, mystery persists in the shadows of human experience. In 1995, a retired physics professor from MIT, Dr. Robert Kellerman, proposed what he called a speculative framework for understanding cases like Margaret Hatfield's. Drawing on quantum field theory and certain interpretations of string theory, Kellerman suggested that consciousness itself might exist as a field that normally remains localized within the physical boundaries of the brain, but that could, under certain conditions, become delocalized or extended beyond those boundaries. If consciousness is understood not as a product of the brain, but rather as a field that the brain ordinarily constrains and localizes, he wrote, then certain unusual neurological states might permit that field to become partially delocalized. In extreme cases, this delocalization might extend to the point where a consciousness no longer remains bound to its physical substrate, effectively separating awareness from the body that typically houses it. Kellerman was careful to present his ideas as speculative rather than empirically supported. He acknowledged that his framework lay at the fringes of scientific inquiry, in the territory where physics meets philosophy. Nevertheless, He argued that cases like Margaret Hatfield's deserved serious scientific consideration precisely because they challenged existing paradigms. Science advances not only by confirming what we already suspect, he concluded, but by investigating phenomena that defy our current understanding. The unexplained disappearances documented in Appalachia represent exactly the kind of anomalous data that, throughout history, has occasionally led to paradigm shifts in scientific thought. Kellerman's papers attracted little mainstream attention, but developed a following among those interested in consciousness studies and the philosophical implications of quantum physics. His ideas remain unproven, yet they highlight the ways in which Margaret Hatfield's case continues to provoke scientific and philosophical speculation more than a century and a half after her disappearance. Pike County continues to change and develop. The mountains are now crossed by highways dotted with cell towers mapped by satellites, yet they remain in many ways as remote and mysterious as they were in 1854. Hikers occasionally report strange experiences in the deep forests, sudden temperature drops, disorienting moments where familiar paths seem suddenly unfamiliar, voices that sound almost but not quite human. In 2001, a group of geology students from the University of Kentucky conducted field research in the area where the Hatfield home once stood. Their primary interest was in the unusual cave systems that run beneath the property. One student, Marcus Brennan, separated from the group briefly and later reported a strange encounter. "I was taking samples near what I believe was the old foundation," he wrote in his field journal, "when I experienced a sudden drop in temperature and a sensation of being watched. When I looked up, I saw what appeared to be a woman standing at the edge of the clearing. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, but the details seemed fluid somehow. When I called out, she didn't respond but raised her hand in what seemed like a gesture of acknowledgement. I blinked, and she was gone." Brennan's experience was dismissed by his colleagues as a momentary hallucination brought on by fatigue or the disorienting effects of the dense forest. Yet similar accounts have been reported sporadically over the decades, always describing a woman in 19th century dress, always at the edge of visibility, always vanishing when approached directly. The site where the Hatfield home once stood is now part of a protected wilderness area. Those who venture there describe an unusual quality to the silence, not merely the absence of sound, but something more profound, as though the very air is listening. Park rangers discourage overnight stays in the area, citing concerns about unstable ground near old mine shafts. Local guides, however, offer a different reason. "Some places don't want human company after dark," one longtime resident explained. "Some places remember what they've witnessed." In 2008, a team from a paranormal investigation television program attempted to conduct an overnight study at the site. Their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, batteries drained inexplicably, recording devices captured only static, compasses spun erratically. The resulting episode, while dramatic in its presentation, offered little in the way of substantive evidence. Yet the team's lead investigator later wrote in a blog post, "In 15 years of investigating allegedly haunted locations, I have never experienced such consistent equipment failure or such a profound sense of otherness. This was not a haunting in any conventional sense. Whatever exists in those woods feels older and more fundamental than any human ghost." The scientific community naturally dismisses such subjective accounts as irrelevant to serious inquiry, yet the persistence of these experiences across generations, reported by individuals with no knowledge of the historical cases, suggests at minimum a cultural phenomenon worthy of anthropological study. At maximum, it hints at something that continues to elude scientific categorization, a persistent anomaly in the fabric of experienced reality. In 2015, Dr. Catherine Ramirez, an anthropologist specializing in folk beliefs and their relationship to landscape, spent 6 months living in Pike County, interviewing residents about local legends and beliefs. Her research uncovered ongoing accounts of unusual experiences in specific locations throughout the region, areas often described as thin places or doorways. She found that these locations corresponded with unusual geological features, including cave systems, unusual mineral deposits, and electromagnetic anomalies. What fascinates me about the Pike County folklore, Ramirez wrote, is not whether these experiences reflect objective reality, but rather how consistently these narratives have persisted despite dramatic cultural and economic changes in the region. The stories told about Margaret Hatfield and others like her represent a continuous tradition spanning over 200 years, a tradition that has survived industrialization, the decline of coal mining, and the digital revolution. Ramirez proposed that these persistent narratives serve a cultural function, expressing something about the relationship between the human and non-human world that cannot be adequately articulated through more conventional means. These stories, she suggested, may be understood as a form of indigenous knowledge, a way of mapping and making sense of a landscape that occasionally behaves in ways that defy conventional understanding. This anthropological perspective offers a framework for understanding the Hatfield case as cultural phenomenon without necessarily dismissing the possibility that something objectively unusual occurred. As Ramirez noted, the dichotomy between real and imaginary, often imposed by Western scientific discourse, fails to capture the complexity of human experience. The people who report these experiences are not delusional or uneducated. They are attempting to articulate encounters that exist at the edges of conventional reality. As for Margaret Hatfield, the woman science couldn't explain, whose story left no witnesses, she exists now only in fragments of documents, in folklore, in questions without answers. Whatever transformation she experienced, whatever threshold she crossed, she took her secrets with her. All that remains is the echo of her passage through the world, a case that reminds us that despite our advances in understanding, mystery still dwells in the shadows of the mountains, in the spaces between established facts, in the stories that refuse conventional explanation. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some boundaries are meant to remain uncrossed, some questions unanswered. Or perhaps, as Margaret herself supposedly said in her final documented words, "What I have become cannot be explained in words you would understand." In 2017, a meteorological research station established near the former Hatfield property recorded an unusual pattern of localized temperature fluctuations, rapid drops of up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit occurring in a precisely defined area approximately 50 feet in diameter. These fluctuations followed no discernible pattern related to time of day or weather conditions. Equipment designed to measure electromagnetic fields in the same area detected periodic spikes of activity that corresponded roughly with the temperature changes. Dr. James Whittaker, the atmospheric physicist who analyzed the data, found no conventional explanation for these phenomena. The temperature fluctuations we observed cannot be attributed to any known meteorological process, he wrote in his report. The sharply defined boundaries of the affected area and the absence of corresponding atmospheric pressure changes violate basic principles of thermodynamics. Whittaker suggested that the anomalies might result from some as yet unidentified geophysical process related to the unusual cave systems beneath the site. He recommended further study, though funding for the project was discontinued the following year due to budget constraints. The last scientific investigation of the area occurred in 2020, when a small team from a university quantum physics laboratory conducted experiments designed to detect quantum fluctuations in the region where the anomalies had been recorded. Their preliminary findings, never published in a peer-reviewed journal, but presented at a conference on quantum field theory, indicated what the lead researcher described as quantum coherence at macroscopic scales, not typically observed outside laboratory conditions. The researcher, Dr. Elena Vasquez, later stated in an interview, "I entered this project deeply skeptical of the folklore surrounding the site. I expected to debunk local superstitions with hard data. Instead, we recorded patterns that, according to current understanding of quantum mechanics, should not be possible in a non-controlled environment. I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, merely that this particular location exhibits physical properties that defy our current explanatory frameworks. The forests of Pike County keep their secrets. The mountains stand silent witness to transformations we can only glimpse. And somewhere, perhaps in a dimension adjacent to our own, Margaret Hatfield continues her journey, beyond explanation, beyond witness, beyond the limitations of the world she left behind. In the end, her case reminds us that science is not a body of settled facts, but an ongoing process of discovery, one that occasionally encounters phenomena that resist categorization, explanation, or resolution. As Dr. Vasquez noted in the conclusion of her conference presentation, the most scientifically honest position is sometimes to acknowledge the boundaries of our understanding, not as an excuse to stop questioning, but as an invitation to question more deeply. The story of Margaret Hatfield, the woman science couldn't explain, continues to echo through time, reminding us that mystery persists even in an age of unprecedented scientific advancement. Her disappearance represents not a failure of scientific inquiry, but rather a challenge to expand the boundaries of what we consider possible. In that sense, she has never truly vanished at all, but remains present in the questions her case continues to provoke, questions that may someday lead to new understandings of consciousness, reality, and the nature of transformation itself.